Welcome to the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Today, I am coming to you from Washington, D.C., where our guest is Spencer Klavan. Spencer is the host of the Young Heretics podcast. He's also an assistant editor at the Claremont Institute. Spencer, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Emily. It's a pleasure.
Why don't you tell us just a little bit about your podcast right off the bat? How long has it been around? How long have you been doing it now?
Well, gosh, we're at episode 12 and we do a weekly show. So I guess 12 weeks is the answer to that question. And yeah, it started because, I am somebody who was just so saddened by what's been going on in our academies of higher education. It's like, I'm a creature of the academy in many ways. I did a PhD in Oxford, and just before I came here to the US to start working at Claremont, and I love learning for its own sake. I'm deeply passionate about the West. I have had wonderful professors in my past, and it just breaks my heart to watch it's really a kind of insanity, a kind of mania that is a collective mass mania that's taking over our academies of higher learning. The most recent iteration of this is that you have academics arguing that 2 + 2 = 5. And the reason for that is they don't want objective reality, because objective reality is somehow racist. Now we're so many steps down the line from this, but it was happening in 2016 too. At Yale, my alma mater, they tried to decolonize the English. They did decolonize the English degree, so you don't have to read Shakespeare because he's like a white dude, basically. And this, to me, there's just such a terrible loss in that. It's as if you have these professors standing outside this enormous treasure trove of stuff. I'm gesturing to the books behind me here because it's just this fabulous wealth of 2,000 plus years of Western culture, more than that, 2,700 years. And it is the inheritance of you and me and everybody who lives in the West. It's the inheritance really of everybody. If you sort of expand these universal truths, anybody that wants to can grasp some of these great Socratic and Judeo-Christian truths. And so it just struck me as a crying shame that this was happening. And I thought that a lot of people were getting denied a classical education. I just thought, let us have an hour a week to really dig into these riches and give people back some of their birthright. So that's what the show's about.
This is obviously timely, and you mentioned the 2 + 2 = 5 controversy. Can you shed a little bit of light on that, where it came from, and why that is so dangerous to our society? This is a strain of thought that I think is bubbling up in the media and, even creeping into the mainstream media.
Yeah, happily. So the ringleader of this, the valiant fighter for truth in this is James Lindsey, who is one of the, I think, great academics currently living and writing. And he was a participant in what was called the so-called squared hoax, in which a bunch of 3 academics wrote fake papers, feminist theory papers and sort of radical critical theory papers, arguing the most ridiculous stuff. I think that dog parks were sexist or something, insane, and got them accepted. So they just made clear that peer review is a complete joke in these sort of so-called disciplines that they've made up. And so, James has become a real kind of central figure. He's not a right-wing ideologue. He's just somebody that cares deeply about objective truth and our small L liberal tradition of freedom of speech. And he has been warning people about this for a long time. And at one point he said, just watch, they'll start arguing that 2 + 2 = 5, which is this famous thing actually straight out of George Orwell's 1984. This used to be the left's big thing. It used to be like, oh, we're going into 1984 because Donald Trump, blah, 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 or whatever, And now, simply because 2 + 2 = 4 is kind of one of our most basic ways of saying there's something independent of my arbitrary decision that I am beholden to. I have to agree. I can't just decide that 2 + 2 = 5. And this drives cultural Marxists insane. This drives the folks that are currently doing their best to dismantle our civilization are striking at this because, as Orwell knew, it is one of the foundational sort of acknowledgements that you have to make in order to have any kind of discussion. Behind all of this, and this is something that hasn't been quite as remarked upon is that, this is the very origins of Western philosophy. Back in 5th century BC, ancient Athens, famous Socrates, the barefoot sage, right, was surrounded by guys that believed 2 + 2 could equal 5. We think this is some new, radical, sexy, exciting idea. It's the oldest trick in the book. It's been around for over 2,000 years. And it basically is primitive thought. It's basically the first thing that mankind says is, I am the measure of all things. And this 2 + 2 = 4. The math tradition is the Socratic tradition of saying, nope, you are not actually the last word on reality. So that's the fight we're in right now.
That's really interesting that you say, because this notion of, I think what it comes down to is moral relativism is dressed up right now as sophisticated philosophy. And you can, trace that back to people like Foucault, and you can go to the critical theorists. I'm curious, I don't think people realize how much moral relativism, the moral relativity of really postmodern society, informs a lot of the mania that we see in academia today. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. I think this 2 + 2 = 5 controversy did shed a lot of light on it. I think, people are starting to see that this is at its core, it is moral relativism, and moral relativism, as the 2 + 2 = 5 example displays, is ridiculous. It's not tethered to reality. But I do think that, I'm curious, do you agree that moral relativism, the philosophy of moral relativism, is at the core of so much of what we're seeing right now in terms of the left's mania?
I do agree. I'm really glad to hear you mention the name of Foucault. I think that's an important kind of link in this chain. And you know who knew this actually? G.K. Chesterton, who was a very sort of winsome British Christian apologist, knew that 2 + 2 = 4 and murder in cold blood is wrong are related to one another. And the way that they're related is that they say that your mind is a machine not just for self-gratification, but a machine for perception of things that exist outside of us. There's a long, long philosophical tradition about, just what are those things outside of us? How can we know anything about them? But basically, the two sides in the debate are our perceptions just kind of a random happenstance, or do they relate to something stable that we can't change just by thinking about it? Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, when he pretends to go mad, says there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. That is now, the raving of a madman is now the kind of Foucauldian rallying cry of the left that you can just sort of declare. And we, I think, have been vulnerable to it. We on the right, or those of us simply who believe in objective truth, have been vulnerable to it because we bought into the idea that 2 + 2 = 4 is a different kind of truth than thou shalt not kill. And we think, because moral truths exist so plainly in our relationship with the world, they're like beauty. You see a sunset, that sunset is beautiful, but if there were no humans, there would be no such thing as beauty. It exists in the relationship between your mind and the world. And one of the funny things that's happening right now in quantum physics and physics more generally is people are realizing that that's true of all creation. This is why in Genesis, God puts man on earth and then says, name the animals, right? This is not what happens, by the way, in the Quran. In the Quran, God teaches man the names of the animals. But in Genesis, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, man is part of the kind of perceiving of the truths of the world. And so we kind of bought into this idea that means they're arbitrary, that we can just say, well, that sunset isn't beautiful, and that garbage can is, and there was a big movement in arts to kind of take like a urinal and put it in a museum because it was just all thought to be arbitrary. But subjectivity isn't arbitrariness, right? And that this is the great sort of fallacy that just because something only exists in our experience doesn't mean that we can just change it by wishing it away. And so the leftists actually know better that 2 + 2 = 4 and thou shalt not kill are the same thing. They're basic truths of the universe that we have to use our minds to discern, or we're not using our minds rightly at all.
We talked about Foucault. What are the other academic roots of this notion? Because you mentioned it's something that is a very primitive way of thinking, and I think it's accurate to trace that back to different strains of thought that have developed in terms of faith traditions. Mm-hmm. But this resurged really at the turn of the 20th century. And maybe you disagree with that, but I'm wondering what do you think the academic roots, other than somebody like Foucault, are to this idea, and why are they now popularizing in the year 2020 with so many young people who I don't think are really even aware of what they're embracing?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I don't want to turn this into like the blame the Germans hour, because it's kind of be that sometimes where it's like, oh, the Frankfurt School, oh, Nietzsche. But I do think that Friedrich Nietzsche is an incredibly important figure in this. And in many ways, I mean, Nietzsche was a brilliant thinker, unlike Foucault, whom I don't rate very highly. I love reading Nietzsche. I find him very powerful and thought-provoking, but deeply wrong. And the reason I think he's deeply wrong is because he's right because he sees what it means to reject the Judeo-Christian tradition. Everybody else who says, like, I'm an atheist, Tom Holland has just written a great book about this, that if you say I'm an atheist, you still haven't really shucked off this huge moral inheritance of Christianity, things like the weak matter, that every human being has value. That stuff is still actually deeply intuitive, even to social justice warriors, and it comes right from Paul's apologetics and Jesus, and then the Jewish tradition before him, and that sort of thing is something that Nietzsche basically just thinks of as weakness. And he expressly, in many of his works, refers back to what you call the pre-Socratics, those guys I was mentioning earlier. This is like Heraclitus especially. All things are in flux, right? That there is no stable reality, no stable knowledge. So that's kind of one strand of it, is this German strand, this Nietzschean relativism. And then the other strand of it, I think, is Marxian thought. And this was a purposeful attempt by socialists, essentially, when they realized that their arguments couldn't win on the merits. They decided they were going to make a long march through the institutions. And this, of course, goes back to Marx, who is he's a materialist in many ways. And he basically believes that the physical stuff of the world is the only thing that's real. And they have been, the Marxists have been attempting successfully to install this into not just our universities, but our elementary schools and our high schools for a long, long time now. And this is, what we're seeing now is only the very last logical conclusion of that 50, 60 year long march.
Right, it's really the fruit of it. And a lot of people tie Nietzsche to Darwin. And I think it is interesting to evaluate Nietzsche through the lens of what was happening technologically when he was thinking and when he was writing. And I do wonder if there's something, if that's a lens that we should be looking at, that we should be looking through today when we're evaluating the development of some of these very radical strains of progressivism, which reject basic science. I mean, even looking at gender gets tied to Gnosticism a lot. The left's take on gender gets tied to Gnosticism a lot. But I do wonder if, in the same way that technology and science were advancing what humans knew about the world and the universe at the time that Nietzsche was writing and Nietzsche's peers were writing, is there something similar happening today in terms of social media, in terms of how we understand the world? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, well, Darwinism is kind of an important strain of thought to raise, a claim about the way that biological organisms develop, which on its face is a kind of verifiable, falsifiable claim. You go out and you study the fossil records, you study kind of how fruit flies develop and all that stuff, and it seems kind of harmless. But basically, I believe that what happened is that fused with Freudianism. And this was, people love to read guys like C.S. Lewis from the kind of period between the wars and World War II, especially. And the Abolition of Man from 1943 is kind of one of his most famous statements of objective truth against abstract reality. What people don't get a lot of the time is that Lewis is shadowboxing with Freud there. He's in this kind of battle, and he says this in Surprised by Joy, that the Freudian philosophy, which is a materialist philosophy and believes that the higher truths are these kind of brain farts, that like our animal impulses get repurposed by our mind and explained with these narratives about things like God and so forth. And so you had that strain of thought going on, which I think is really exactly backwards. I think that our higher impulses are the reality. Aristotle believed this, basically, that the higher you get up the train of thought, the closer you are to what's really stable and true. And Plato also, of course, is famous for arguing something similar, although different. Freud basically flips that on its head. He's profoundly influential. We don't even realize anymore how much we're all Freudians. Our basic assumptions, our gut assumptions, are Freudian assumptions, that if you scrape away the detritus of society, you'll get down to natural man. You'll get down to kind of what humans really are. This is where gender as a social construct comes from, that, if you can just clear out all the stuff that we teach each other in these broken societal systems, then you'll get to what you really are. But of course, Aristotle says man is a political animal. Man relates to others, and the things that we do in society are part of our nature. And so this is kind of countervailing tradition, this Freudian idea that it's all about your primal urges. And then when that kind of forms this unholy union with Darwinism, you get this thing where Darwin says, well, you and me, baby, aren't nothing but mammals, right? And that the way that our biology develops is determinative of all that we are, what we want, what we think, what we desire. And I think that a lot of folks who are expressing discontent with that right now, there's a funny kind of dual thing going on. One is that people think that they're just their bodies, and the other is that kind of Gnostic strain that you mentioned, which is that nobody can live that way. Nobody can actually live as if you're just your sexual urges, just your hungers, just your sort of animal grunts and squeaks. And so now that we're basically reinventing the spirit, which if we had just sort of stuck with the Judeo-Christian tradition, we would have known is perfectly real, is a central part of us. But the idea that there is some kind of abstract fairy unicorn version of you that you can scrape away in a Freudian way and get at, is this sort of strange, nonsensical, and yet weirdly intuitive amalgam that people are latching onto because they don't have anything better, really.
Well, and that's interesting because it's, in a sense, as you mentioned, it's materialist, but it's also kind of Gnostic. And isn't that incoherent?
Right. Well, this is something my colleague James Poulos at the Claremont Institute is always.
Yes.
You know him.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. James is great.
He's awesome, and he is always emphasizing that conservatives get this wrong. We think that if we can just point out one more logical inconsistency in woke philosophy, if we can just argue that this doesn't quite make any sense, then the pure cognitive dissonance of melding materialism with Gnosticism will just cause people to throw up their hands and say, you're right, of course, like the West is great, etc. The nonsense is the point. Saying 2 + 2 = 5 is a tactic to put us on the back foot. This is actually part of why Young Heretics is structured the way it is Lewis himself said, a man can't always be defending the truth. There must come a time to feed upon it. And I think that there is a point at which you have to just say, that I'm not going to be able to argue you out of this crazy nonsense. The better thing to do is to offer people something truer and better, and to offer it in a way that will play in the media landscape. That's a really hard thing, right? Is to feed truth into Twitter and into social media. But I mean, that's what, honestly, I think the Federalists is really good at doing, and that's what we try to do. But the inconsistency of it is part of the tactic for just dismantling stuff, embracing the inconsistencies. And you can't argue people out of this, unfortunately.
It's interesting because I've heard the argument that this is being deployed as a tactic, and I actually think the fact that it's so incoherent undercuts that argument, because the incoherence, I think, is strong evidence that it's not purposeful. It's actually that people are just totally caught up in this whirlwind for, it's been, we're going on almost 150 years of this sort of like postmodernism breaking down what the Enlightenment sort of taught us and what the Judeo-Christian tradition taught us was true about the world, and, sort of structured our perspective. Do you think that this is, and if so, who is out there sort of deploying this strategically? I'm open to the argument. I almost think they're too incompetent and too sort of wrapped up in a very incoherent worldview to project any sort of strategy onto society at large.
So yeah, I really take this point, and I think you're making very articulate arguments. That GIF, why don't we have both? That's how I feel about this. Right. Both of these things can be true. I mean, when you look at BLM, Black Lives Matter, which is a movement run by PhDs, by self-avowed trained Marxists, and which, some of these guys get Soros money. There's like a ton of very high-level elite society backing for this stuff. And this has always been true of socialist movements and Marxist movements. You look at these this very proletarian rhetoric, this idea that this whole thing is about the middleman. And then they always end up arguing that the actual little man has to have a consciousness raising, because the average person on the street doesn't really believe these things. And so I think that the people who are swept up in this are the majority of it, and that the people who are consciously manipulating them as a tactic are the minority, but they're the guys in charge. They're basically pulling the strings. I mean, it sounds a bit like a conspiracy theory, except when you look at the fact that like all the donations to Black Lives Matter go right to like Joe Biden's campaign. So you can't really get more elitist than that. And it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's not a huge exaggeration. This is in some sense becoming more and more a kind of wing, an enforcement wing of the Democrat Party. And it's run by people that are way up on the stuff that you and I are talking about, and just as sophisticated as you and I are about strategizing. But I agree with you that most people who are kind of wrapped in this postmodernist incoherence are probably not thinking, I know what I'll do today. I'll go out and destroy Western civilization. And that's part of why I have some sympathy for them, actually. I don't think that those people are evil or bad. I think they're just terribly misled.
Yeah, I think they've sort of been, directed through our system of higher education and, even our system of secondary education, and totally, their intellectual foundation is built on a really not the most solid ground. And so that informs the way that they act for the rest of their lives. And we're seeing the fruits of that right now, I think, in millennial generation and Gen Z as they're coming up. It's interesting because you remind me of a moment in 2016 when Susan Sarandon was on Chris Hayes' show. And I actually just wrote about this a couple of weeks ago, when Susan Sarandon said, Hayes asked her, if she's going to vote for Hillary Clinton. And she was like, I don't know. Trump may be better for the revolution because he may bring the revolution sooner. And Hayes looks at her and he goes, oh, so you're talking about like a Marxist Marxist-Leninist heighten the contradictions type of situation. And she agreed with that. Wow. And that is to what you're saying about, there are some people sort of that are the puppet masters of the left's movement. And I don't say that to mean to be conspiratorial. I mean, the people that are sort of at the top of the movement, they are, like BLM will say, they're trained Marxists. And there are people downstream of that, basically the entire movement, that I don't think really understands Marxism. I don't think really would understand the heighten the contradictions reference, which is a complicated theory in and of itself that can be interpreted differently. But it does seem, you're right, that there is an effort afoot to heighten the contradictions among some of those upper level, some of the more powerful people on the left. And at the same time, if they wanted to do that, you'd think that they would be enjoying the Trump presidency a bit more than they are.
I know. Well, that's true. At least we're having fun on the right. That's the thing. You actually, funnily, one doesn't actually have to be conspiratorial about this, because as you indicated with Sarandon, they often just tell you. They often come right out and tell you. And this is true even going back again to, the kind of Stalinist turn in Marxism and socialism, which is to say that Stalin at one point, I think it was in the 30s, said, we're going to adopt a tactic here in which we call everybody to the right of us fascist. And the reason they did that is because they knew that fascism had become a dirty word, that people were traumatized by the rise of fascism, and would respond viscerally to that word. And they sort of adopted this tactic, and it was kind of popularized in 1950 by Theodor Adorno, who came up with the F scale, F for fascist, all these attributes that make somebody more or less fascist. And they are things like patriotism, right? I mean, there's stuff like devotion to country. And the more you have of those, the more fascist you are. And so you can go and read this. You can go and read both of these texts and be perfectly aware that when they call Donald Trump a Nazi, when they call you a fascist, when they say that you're a neo whatever, they're doing something that has been taught to them by decades of strategizing among Marxian and socialist elites. It's just that most people don't actually take the time to go around thinking about that sort of thing. But I also think that, the emotional side of it is something of a different story. The fact that they hate Trump, so they can't help themselves from hating Trump so much, even if they do kind of think he might be strategically good for them.
It's interesting to your point that, the Communist Manifesto is one of the most assigned books in universities based on studies, which I don't object to that at all. I think it's an important artifact of history that people should be studying. But I don't think that that's actually inspired a generation of Marxists. I think what it's done, if anything, is maybe normalized Marx. I don't think a lot of people actually really understand Marx. It's, you know, a lot of people on the left actually understand Marx. I think it's more that it's been normalized in the university system. And to your point, and to the point that James Poulos makes, it's true that logic is not the way to win this battle, which is a part of a larger culture war. I mean, this is about something so much bigger and deeper than one election, or about our daily politics. So if we can't rely on logic, if we can't rely on saying, you know, there are obviously two distinct biological sexes, and this, whatever you're talking about, doesn't exist. If we can't rely on logic, what is the pathway forward for a successful, you know, for a victory in the culture war, frankly?
Well, I think there's an important thing to say before we get to that sort of strategery, as they say, to that strategizing, which is, you know, we don't say stop relying on logic because we don't think we have the right logical arguments, right? People might get confused that that's sort of where we're at. We're not there. We still believe that our ideas make more sense, as we always have on the right. But what we have noticed, and what you just articulated quite well, is that it's about more than rational argument in our current public sphere. And you can lament that, or you can be delighted about it, but you can't actually really change it. You know, when a big medium shift comes along, like social media, it just changes the rules of the game. And the right is very afraid of things like rhetorical posturing, of things like fighting dirty in the culture wars, because we value things like civility and genteel discourse, right? And we want, when somebody makes an argument, we want to say, as you and I have had this discussion, if somebody says something that is not what you just said, you want to say, well, I agree with you here, I disagree with you here. Right? That's sort of like the whole game for us, you know?
Oh, you're dragging us into the Sohrab Ahmari, David French war here.
Yeah, right, exactly. This is the thing, you know, and that whole sordid affair, which was sort of scrappy and very distasteful to a lot of people, but nevertheless, like, triggered a real conversation on the right about some of these issues. You know, we feel like we want to concede stuff to people because that's the right thing to do. And in my view, you only do that if you are arguing with somebody in good faith. And we're not in that position anymore. We're in essentially a fist fight for the country. And I don't mean that quite literally, at least yet, I hope. You know, we haven't taken up arms against each other in a civil war. But we are in a situation in which people like Nicole Hannah-Jones, author of the 1619 Project, is weaponizing, those people are weaponizing our own sense of introspection and our own sense of guilt. And that tactic means that any concession you make can and will be used against you. Just like if we were in a fist fight and you point out that my shoe's untied, it's like, yeah, I should go fix my shoe, but not right now, because you're just telling me my shoe's untied so you can deck me in the jaw. You know, that's kind of like how that works. And so, by the way, I would never get into a fist fight. I just want to make that clear. But but that's, I believe that's the situation in which we find ourselves. And I just think that we should grant no concessions, make no apologies anymore, because it's been made clear that although that's being demanded of us, that will not be accepted or valued from our interlocutors.
Well, let's stick with the 1619 case study, because it's an interesting one for a variety of reasons, as our listeners certainly know. It's interesting to the point that you just made in particular, that, so I'm curious, in your mind, what took this conversation or the culture war, however we want to describe it, from what it was before to the fist fight? What is it that distinguishes this moment from the past moments in the past? Because 1619, as an example, that is something that can be traced back to Howard Zinn. That goes back decades. It's something it's a strain of leftism that's been around for a long time, that's been normalized in the university system for a long time. Is it that we now live in a world where something as radical and, you know, disconnected from factual reality — they had to issue a correction, by the way, after a bunch of liberal historians spoke out — is it that we are now in a moment where something like that could be published in the pages of the New York Times and win a Pulitzer Prize? Is that what takes it from what it was before to the fist fight?
Well, actually, Howard Zinn is exactly the right person to invoke here as the predecessor to the 1619 Project, this kind of fundamentally anti-American revisionist history, which also has been, by the way, Zinn has also been quite strongly criticized by left and right for his historical, let's say, selectionism. He's highly selective and in many cases quite disingenuous. But he's been a standard textbook in high schools for some time. I sort of think that what happened is the right finally caught wise. I mean, the reason that the 1619 Project can rocket on apace, despite the fact that it has been quite thoroughly debunked by innumerable scholars, as you point out, in the Atlantic and major institutions, there's a Marxist society that released a statement against it, so as you say, it's got the same historical worth as like an Arby's napkin, basically. But the fact that it can continue on, nevertheless, to be installed into curricula in high schools and below, is precisely because the Pulitzer Foundation is 100% behind it, right? That the institutions are already so thoroughly owned by Zinn-trained leftists. And we, I think, in many ways, let that happen because we thought that they were arguing in good faith. We thought that the Zinns of the world were presenting an alternative opinion that we could engage with. And so we basically were like, sure, teach it in high schools, we'll have kids argue about it, whatever. And then we turned around and it was like, that was never the game. The left has never been playing that game. We were the only ones playing that game. And it's just the fact that we got into the fist fight that make it happen. Otherwise it was just a constant pummeling, a boot in the conservative space for decades.
I think you're more fluent in philosophy than I am, so I want to ask you a question while we have you here. I wrote a piece this week about the sort of ramp from Foucault to Judith Butler and bell hooks and Peggy McIntosh to where we are now, and that the reason we have what I refer to as a progressive or bigot binary, where everything that is slightly to the right of full progressivism, Noam Chomsky signing the Harper's letter, anything that doesn't accept every tenet of the dogma is bigotry. That can really go back to the post-structuralists and then to bell hooks and to Peggy McIntosh and Judith Butler, who are assigned en masse in college classrooms. So is it the way that you see this, the process to where we are now? Do you start that with Marx and Engels, go to Nietzsche and Freud, then go to Foucault, and then keep going on to somebody like bell hooks, and eventually that progression, no pun intended, that progression leads us to critical mass in the workforce as more and more people go through the university system? Do you think that's an accurate description of the process, or is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, I really liked your article about this, and I think that you can invoke here something that you and I have now just talked about, which is that F scale, that idea that kind of anything that isn't communism is fascism, which again was a purposeful strategy on the part of socialists to kind of make this situation exist. And the philosophical lineages that you outline, which by the way, include several diverse strands of thought. Foucault is not expressly exactly a Nietzschean, and Nietzsche is not exactly Marx. There are nuances here that we could delight in unpacking if it were kind of our goal. But I think that another feature of this must have to do with, Marx himself, as you kind of alluded to. Marx is impenetrable. You can dice him and slice him and eventually get to what he's saying. But he's a purposefully unclear writer, I believe, quite clearly, and that kind of jargon-choked rhetoric, which comes up again in Butler. Butler's work again.
I was just gonna say, for a linguist, she's awfully difficult to discern.
The best thing I've ever read about Butler is Douglas Murray in his book, The Madness of Crowds. He just block quotes her. He just takes a chunk of her book and says, "Here's this quote," and the next sentence is simply, "Writing this bad or prose this bad can only occur when the author is hiding something." And that seems right to me. And so
nobody says less with more words than Judith Butler.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's a great way of putting it. 100%. And I think that the fact that was done, I think intentionally to a certain degree. I really, as a writer, and I imagine that you probably agree, I believe that clear writing is clear thought. And that the better you can express yourself, the more directly you can express yourself. And if somebody is writing unintelligibly, that person is probably not actually thinking things all the way through, or doesn't at least have a coherent argument so much as just an impulse or an irritable mental gesture, as they say. And so there's that element to it. And then once you get into that space where kind of everybody is saying one thing, is progressive or bigot, then you get into this sort of scenario where a lot of people suspect that the orthodoxy is wrong, but can't have any way of getting at each other, right? They can't connect about this because each one of them is worried that if he or she speaks up, he or she will be blacklisted, hounded from employment, and so forth. I can't tell you how many letters I've gotten since starting Young Heretics, academics saying, I'm on your side here. I believe in this, but I can't talk about it because I will be pilloried. And I'm lucky, you're lucky. Our employers will get on our case if we don't speak up enough, right? We are here basically trying to fight this good fight. A lot of people out there will genuinely face serious consequences if they speak up. And there's no substitute, unfortunately, for the courage of just standing by that truth. I think more and more people will follow. I think Barry Weiss and Trader Joe's and these examples of people who kind of, or companies that just shrug this stuff off. The more you do that, it's the emperor has no clothes. It really works, but you have to have that first person, that Spartacus that's willing to stand up.
Well, yeah, it really works because most people think that these complaints are ridiculous, and they do come from a chorus. It's such a small chorus of voices that is disproportionately loud because they utilize social media, and these companies are just terrified of getting on the wrong side of them and creating PR crises. But when you stand up, I think people love it. I mean, Goya, Trader Joe's, the left will complain as much as they can, but to average people, it just doesn't matter that much. I'm curious, I want to zoom out again and have a conversation about the progression of our society from one where, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that, and I'm not advocating for this, by the way, that there was prayer in school. And I do wonder if there's a way to see this progression, when people are writing 100 or 200 years from now, or even more, if the earth survives that long, if we make it through 2020, I wonder if we'll see this moment through through a lens that's similar to the Darwinist lens that Nietzsche is viewed through. Is there something going on right now with social media, which has, you can go back to 2007 and you can look at Gen Z and millennials and you can trace the increase of anxiety directly in that generation, directly back to the release of the iPhone. Is there something going on right now in this weird combination of materialism and Gnosticism that is fueled by the smartphone and by the rapid acceleration of technology that we've seen in the last half century, but also in the last 2 decades?
Well, I certainly think we will look back on this moment as a watershed. How we will look back on it remains to be seen. One big kind of dimension of this question that I have really been wrestling with for some time now, and I've done some sort of musing about on Young Heretics and elsewhere, is, what the Greeks called the cycle of regimes, or anacyclosis, this kind of natural progression from kind of, in some cases it's from democracy into autarky, and then the oligarchs take power from the tyrant, and then the mob takes power or the Democrats rather take power from the oligarchs, and they become a mob, and you get into the tyrant. It's kind of perpetual churning of history. One question I have about that is that inevitable? Because if you've been trained in that tradition, it's kind of painfully obvious where we're at right now, right? We're just at the point where the democracy kind of degenerates into mob rule. And to me, watching Chaz Chop in Seattle was a great example of this, where it was like, okay, so any political philosopher, and I would not characterize myself as a political philosopher. I'm just a philosopher more generally, but you sort of check your watch and say, all right, 5 minutes or so, they're going to get a warlord, right? You're going to get That's what happens. Mob rule. It's like, and so it's sort of tragically clear. And one question I have is, can this be arrested? Can it be undone? And I hope that the answer is yes. Otherwise, there's really no reason to study history. You have to be able to kind of learn from your mistakes. The social media element is crucial. The digital element more generally is crucial. And I really think that we've got to get a grasp on, Plato himself wrote a whole dialogue about how terrible writing was and how writing was this new technology was going to just destroy people's minds. But he was writing, right? And he found a way to take what he loved about conversation into writing. We've got to find a way to take what we love about what you would call classical liberalism, but also our faith traditions, our Judeo-Christian heritage, find a way to make that play in the digital space. And the harder we think about that, the more shot we have, I think, of saving this thing.
What lesson from studying history do you think is crucial to arresting, as you say, this pattern that we seem to be headed in?
I think that one central kind of claim that we need to be making a lot here. You mentioned this idea that there's no such thing as gender. I think we need to really be drilling down on there are men and there are women, and they are very valuable in their uniqueness, and not any kind of like easy reductionist argument about men should do this, women should do that. But instead, things like I really believe men need space in their institutions to push outward into the world. I mean, this is why space, literal space, outer space really excites me. The Elon Musk's of the world really excite me. We need to be learning, because this happened to Rome, that they started expanding, but they didn't let any of the farmers basically just take that land and work it. We need to really be focusing on our middle class and on our kind of manly innovators, our guys that are going to go out there into the new frontier, which is how this country got great to begin with anyway. So.
Oh, that's so interesting, because that's sort of what Camille Paglia talks about as one of the failures of the feminist movement, is not acknowledging that men have built the physical infrastructure of the Western world.
Paglia is great on this, absolutely. I mean, I think she's kind of a darling of the right, an unexpected darling of the right, and I think that's right. She really understands this sexual personae, but also some of her later work about just a feminism that doesn't want women to be women, but wants them to do the man stuff is not feminine.
Not to harp on Paglia, but it's interesting. It makes me think about what you said earlier, that clear writing is an indication of clear thinking. And Paglia is somebody who I think she has sort of a populist tone in her writing. She writes, in a way that most people can read, unlike a Judith Butler. And her voice is really clear and her ideas are really clear. And so you're sort of validating right now why I respect Camille Paglia with that argument.
Yes, certainly. That's right. She's very direct. And what's interesting about that is she's also a kook, and in the best possible way. And writers tend to think, well, my ideas are just so out there that I can't express them in normal language. I really think that's utterly wrong. I believe that radical, weird, new ideas. I think Plato was famous for this, right? Just wrote in the most celebrated prose of Greek antiquity about mind-boggling stuff. Augustine, read the 11th book of his Confessions. It's just completely, galaxy brain, literally in some cases. But it's also plain and beautiful and clear as a bell. So yeah, I think that's an important fact about prose that people don't get.
No, that's a virtue that is completely lost in academia today. I actually sat down and interviewed Camille Paglia for like an hour one time, and she was just a force of nature, like you said. It was the most incredible whirlwind of thought that I've ever experienced. It was like a tornado, just sitting there, and she just can she's churning and churning. It was amazing. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. I was reading through your podcast descriptions. One thing that I wanted to get into is your take on the fall of Rome and whether that's particularly relevant today. But that's a recent episode that you have up, right?
Yes. Well, thanks for mentioning it. And it's actually, I kind of was gesturing in the direction of my take on the fall of Rome, right, which is about space, which is about expansion and the middle class. And there's a two-part series on what's called the Gracchan moment in Roman history, when these kind of demagogues, these populists, rose up and just harnessed all of the legitimate popular frustration with the Senate. And really, the Romans would look back on this as the spark that lit the powder keg and where everything started to go south for the Republic. So we do a deep dive on that for 2 shows, and people can find that wherever they get their podcasts.
Sounds good. I will make sure to check that out. The optimistic way to end is to say, as you mentioned earlier, this is why we have students of history, is to avoid the perils that we know will come for us inevitably in some cases. So thank you very much for adding your perspective. The podcast Young Heretics is available wherever you get your podcasts, right?
Indeed. Yeah, you can just subscribe on iTunes or Google Play or wherever.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Spencer Klavan. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Emily. It's been a pleasure.
Well, this has been another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor here. You can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. We will be back soon with more. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel while you're listening. We bring you all of the podcasts and more with visual representation up there. We really appreciate you listening. Until next time, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.